Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Africa 360. I'm your host, Kwangu Liwewe. Africa is no stranger to conflict. Sadly, the continent has seen decades of civil wars and fighting between its neighbors. But just as the continent began to shake off the bloodshed of the past, a new type of violence has emerged: terrorism. In this asymmetrical warfare, enemies announce themselves with unprecedented horror, and the targets are often unarmed civilians.
The poster state of the Africa Rising story. Kenya is a vibrant, growing economy. A regional leader, Kenya's GDP accounts for 40% of the East African Economic Community's gross domestic product. And Nairobi is determined to be the center of the Silicon Valley of the East, Silicon Sahara. But on a sunny Saturday morning last September, the security of that dream was shattered. 67 people were killed as gunmen stormed the upmarket Westgate shopping mall. The killers, who turned shops and restaurants into a war zone, were identified as Al-Shabaab militants carrying out a revenge attack for Kenya's invasion of neighboring Somalia. Kenyans responded by pulling together through the We Are One campaign, and the government vowed to root out terrorism.
We have overcome terrorist attacks before. In fact, we have fought courageously and defeated them within and outside our borders. We will defeat them again. Terrorism, in and of itself, is the philosophy of cowards.
But the surprise attacks on this stable nation highlighted just how susceptible Africa is to terrorism. The continent may have a history of fighting traditional conflicts, whether it's in the jungle or in the desert. But Africa seems to have no idea how to deal with the enemies of asymmetrical conflict as it fights its own war on terror. Terrorists announce their cause through violent public attacks on civilians. Targets range from bus stops to cinemas, areas that are almost impossible to police. The sources of conflict range from social to religious to economic gripes. And a stable state doesn't guarantee a peaceful state. Africa's largest economy, Nigeria, isn't safe either. While the country prospers in the south, the north is terrorized by Boko Haram. The fundamentalist Islamic group wants to create an independent state governed by Sharia law. The group staged an audacious attack on the capital, Abuja, last year, and are yet to return the more than 200 girls it kidnapped in Chibok earlier this year. The region is terrorized by another group further north, Akim. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb originated in Algeria and now roam the deserts of Niger, Mauritania and Mali. Terrorism is characterized by a global network, with groups sharing resources, training, intelligence from Afghanistan to Mogadishu. And with the growth of the latest terror network, IS, or the Islamic State, controlling terrorists in Africa will only be even more difficult. The Islamic State has favored public beheadings of foreign nationals as retribution for international involvement in Syria and Iraq. And the group has vowed to assist their brothers in arms in Africa. Lindsay Schutel, Johannesburg.
So if Kenya and Nigeria can't get it right, who will? After the break, we look from east to west to find a solution for terrorism on the continent. Please stay with us.
There's no dialogue as far as I'm concerned for Boko Haram. It's all military option.
Welcome back to Africa 360. This week, we're focusing on terrorism on the continent. While terrorist organizations may target governments, their victims are almost always civilians. How do ordinary communities find normality after a terrorist attack? Joining me now from Nairobi, social commentator and satirical cartoonist Patrick Gathara. Patrick, thanks very much for joining us on Africa 360. Now, it's 1 year after Westgate, and after the attacks, we saw this We Are One campaign. What are the sentiments like of the Kenyans after the attacks?
Well, a year after the attack, I think it would be fair to say We Are One has turned into We Are Wondering. And this is because most of the details of what actually happened during the attack have never come out, in spite of the President, Uhuru Kenyatta, promising that there would be a public inquiry into the attack itself. That has actually not happened. So we're in a situation right now where we are not sure what went wrong. There was an obviously bungled security response to this. And it seems that so far very few lessons have actually been learned about the attack itself and about how to prevent similar attacks going forward. So I think the sentiment is more one of disappointment.
Now, Patrick, if you say that Kenyans are wondering, is there a sense of insecurity in the country? Are people afraid of going to the malls? Just tell us what it's like on the ground there in Kenya.
Well, I wouldn't say people are afraid of going to malls. They still frequent malls, and they've seen an increase in security. But the question is really whether a similar incident could happen. The other day, I think about 3 or 4 days ago, we had a car crash just outside one of our malls, and there were reports that actually police started shooting people because, again, there was a sense of panic.
Now, a few weeks ago, we read about reports of some Al-Shabaab members who actually used Jomo Kenyatta Airport to leave the country. And, of course, later on, they were arrested in Germany. Now, undoubtedly, Kenya is the hub of East Africa. So Kenya has a responsibility, of course, of looking after its citizens and its neighbours as well. Can Kenya actually take up this huge responsibility?
Well, the fact is, unless Kenya tries to learn from the incidents that it has had. And it's not just Westgate, it's what has happened even after Westgate. The attack, we've had attacks at the airport. We've had at least one attack, which was initially characterized by the police as an exploding light bulb, but we now know it was an IED there. And there's a reluctance within the security forces to admit when things go wrong, and to admit that they need to improve in their responses. And there's fundamentally a systemic problem with their response and with their capabilities, and how we approach the entire issue of terrorism. And because of this, you see now incidents like you just mentioned. People going through this were guys who had left Al-Shabaab. They say they had gotten tired there, but they still came through our airports, one stopped by our security forces. And you might think, you might start wondering, if former Al-Shabaab members can get onto a plane, what about people who are still committed to using violence?
Mr. Gathara, in your opinion, all that was put into place after Westgate in terms of security, are you happy with what government has put in place?
Well, the fact is we know very little about what government has put in place. And it seems to me that not much has changed. You remember in June this year, I believe, we had the attacks in Peketoni, where a similar number of people were killed. Up to 67 people died. I think it was actually more than 67 who died. And again, the response there was wanting. For 6 hours, gunmen were going house to house, essentially killing people. And there was no security to be seen, despite the fact that Peketoni, which is this town at the coast, is ringed by security. And again, we haven't had the same, there hasn't been an effort to learn what went wrong also at Peketoni so that we can change it. So this culture of not learning, of not inquiring, is really the one that's driving me to be skeptical as to whether anything has changed since Westgate and whether we're actually safer now.
Well, Patrick, now just explain to the viewers, how did we get to the point that East Africa has become the front line of the war on terror?
Well, East Africa is obviously bordered to the northeast by Somalia, which for a long time has had a big problem with an Islamic insurgency, the Al-Shabaab. But also within East Africa, you've got legitimate local grievances. You know, people at, for example, at the coast and in our own, in Kenya, in our own northeastern province, have for decades been marginalized by the government. So if you go to these places, you still find cases where the security forces act with impunity. You know, they burn down markets, they assassinate people who are suspected of colluding with terrorists. You know, and a lot of this breeds resentment. It just creates the feeling that they are somehow separate from the rest of Kenyans that are treated separately. And I think with this, combined with the ideology that is driven by people like Al-Shabaab, the extremist ideology, they make a really potent mix.
Finally, is there any real cooperation between the big powers in the region? We're talking about Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, and Kenya, of course. Maybe Kenya should ask for more help. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, Kenya does need help. That is my feeling. I think we should have more regional cooperation. This is not just a problem for Kenya. The Ugandans who remember in 2010 during the World Cup final was similarly attacked, and we've also heard of attacks in places like Tanzania. So this is a regional problem, and we need a regional approach to it. But more importantly, I think we need to start learning from the mistakes that are made from whenever an incident happens. Instead of trying to cover up, instead of our government treating it as a public relations problem, they need to look at what the security issues are, where the failures are, and then learn the lessons and implement any recommendations that come out of these inquiries so as to improve our response and to ensure that we can prevent attacks going forward.
Well, Patrick Katara, thank you very much for speaking to Africa 360. While Kenya's terrorist attacks are sporadic, Nigeria's north has also been battered by constant onslaught from Boko Haram. The Islamic fundamentalist group has staged audacious attacks on the capital, Abuja, and have yet to release more than 200 captured schoolgirls. Nigeria appears to be without a solution in dealing with this threat. Joining me now from Lagos is security expert Dr. Ona Ekemu. Let's go straight into the interview now. Dr. Ekemu, why is Nigeria in particular failing to curb Boko Haram?
Well, when we had the first IED attacks in Nigeria, take, for example, the police headquarters bombing on June 26, 2011. We denied. It is incomprehensible. But I think the government has finally gotten the true hint. It was very reassuring to hear the Senate President the other day come out and say, look, we are in fact at war, and Mr. President should declare that Nigeria is at war with Boko Haram, such that this orgy of violence can be brought under control.
Now, with elections just around the corner, do you expect to see an escalated attack ahead of the polls to further discredit President Goodluck Jonathan?
Well, if we are correlating election with attacks, then it will appear as if they are both linked. But I don't think they are linked. It's typical of these terrorists and these fundamentalists. They take local issues and they tie into them. They want to disenfranchise people. They don't want normal political change to take place. They want change by violence. So why should they allow people who want to have political change through the ballot box? They don't have any reason to encourage that. So what they do is they do a lot of violence on those days, those symbolic days, just to show that we have a lot of power. But we have seen the extent of their power is a puny power.
Dr. Ekemu, it's been 1 year since the Westgate attacks, and during this time we've seen Nigeria have a lot of attacks as well. But we don't seem to see this reaction like the one we saw in Westgate, where there's 24 hours news coverage on the issue. Why do you think this is so? Is it because a lot of foreigners died in Kenya as opposed to what's happening in Nigeria?
Well, I think like you said, Westgate was the first major terrorist attack. But the point here is when we had the attack, the first one, the first big attack here, which will be the FHQ bombing, 26th of June 2011, we were shocked. There is a shock value. When it happens the first time, it happens the second time, they bomb UN building, kill 24 persons, and so on and so forth. There's a shock value. It's like, wow, is this possible? Now, the thing there is law enforcement and, in fact, in this case, the military and the intelligence agencies, they're supposed to step up and ensure that it doesn't happen. But when it becomes common currency, when it happens every day, it gets to a point that people become immune to it. It's like, oh, well, oh, another bombing. All right, well, too bad. Sorry, we pray for the souls of those who have been killed.
Now, we know the source of terrorism has some social aspects to it as well as the political ones. And if we look at the north of the country, it's very deprived. Is the Nigerian government doing anything to address these social issues?
Even though the Nigerian authorities are beginning to understand that this is an existential threat, it's a very serious threat, but they still don't quite get it. They think it's about poverty. They think it's about youth unemployment. So with all these kinds of dynamics all over the internet, jihadi websites, and then even ISIS recruitment videos is a big problem, because ISIS is putting out videos of its atrocities, and to very young, impressionable minds, it is exciting, it's glamorous. It's like, oh, this is the life. So these are the kinds of things that are happening and that are creating, fundamentalism all over. But I think also a point must be made here, just for sake of balance, that in fact, if we didn't have as much bad governance as we have right now, perhaps some people might just be fence sitters. They'll just look on. They may not agree with the government, but they will not agree with the fundamentalists. But when the fundamentalists are saying, you see, your government is mistreating you, they are not good to you, they don't want you, they hate Muslims, they don't want our brand of Islam, it's easy for that message to sink in.
Now, we've seen the Nigerian government try to solve this problem militarily, and also they've tried dialogue, and both don't seem to be working. Is there any other way they can deal with this issue?
There's no dialogue as far as I'm concerned for Boko Haram. It's all military option. When you finish shooting, when you've conquered them, then you can come and tell them and say, what was your problem? You can dialogue after. But you don't dialogue when you have a shooting war going on. You first win the war. You can't bring out a document of surrender or whatever and say, surrender, and you are shooting. You'll say, why should I surrender? You surrender. Who are you telling to surrender? It's like Shekau said the other time. He said that when the federal government said they were offering amnesty to Boko Haram, Shekau said, I am the one to offer amnesty to the federal government, not the other way around. That's the impudence and that we are seeing there. The only end I can contemplate for them is a very, very bad end. And I hope the government will not come up with this is usual political compromise of let's give amnesty. Amnesty, nothing. We can't give amnesty in this case. We must exact a pound of flesh for every evil that was done by these people.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ekemu.
Thank you very much.
So how do you stop an enemy that you don't see coming? Stay with us as we explore the issue after the break. Joining me now is Martin Iwi from the Institute of Security Studies, and also joining us from our Pretoria studios is Professor Mark Hull. He's from the University of Pretoria. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time and for joining us on Africa 360. Professor, I'll start with you. It's 1 year since the Westgate attacks in Kenya. And of course, we did see security services there beef up the security in the country, but there have been constant attacks after that. Why is that so? Is there a weakening in the system of the security forces there?
Well, I think this is the problem with any insurgency. It is very difficult to totally eradicate it or prevent it. And Kenya's ongoing involvement in Somalia in the peace operations. There are large numbers of Somalian refugees in Kenya. And there are some allegations of corruption within the security forces. And then, of course, more recently, the attacks have been blamed on ethnic friction rather than on Al-Shabaab insurgents.
Now, when we talk about terrorism, we talk about the globalization of terrorism. We've seen groups such as Akim influence Boko Haram. Boko Haram, of course, getting influence from Al-Shabaab. Isn't this a very worrying trend?
There is no ready solution, and in many cases, these groups are not prepared to negotiate about anything. they are not willing to participate in any peace talks. We are to some extent seeing this problem in the Middle East as well.
So if there's no solution, Professor, if there's no solution,
there is no real
solution, then what can be done?
To this.
Then what can be done, honestly? Do we just sit back and watch it?
No, certainly we have to improve on what is being done at the moment. And again, if there are any political and socio-economic issues, to include these in the total effort, not just deploying more police, more troops, adopting new legislation.
I do agree with the professor to some extent in terms of some of the solutions that he has provided. But I think whether it's a religious or non-religious groups, I think they can be controlled, they can be contained. Algeria is a living example of how they were able to bring terrorism really to the dimension that they have it today. Remember in the 90s, there was no single day that will go by in Nigeria without an attack. Today, Algeria is largely peaceful. So I think that if the right measures are taken, as I said...
What were some of those measures Algeria took where Nigeria and Kenya can learn lessons from?
Algeria refused to give these terrorists the space, which means acting proactively, acting with intelligence. So intelligence has to be proactive. We are saying that African countries, they need to take terrorism seriously, put the right measures in place, and stop the lackluster approach that they have had in the past 13 years or so, and to actually act proactively so that we can actually make headway. Whether it's a religious group or not, there are solutions, and these solutions are lying there, and we don't want to pick them up.
Professor, talking about solutions, clearly we've heard Africans talk a lot about Africans finding their own solutions finding solutions to the problems on the continent. How do you view this in terms of curbing terrorism? Can Africans, do we have the capacity to deal with it on our own?
Well, I would think in terms of the cost of countermeasures and in terms of technology, it's very clear that they are still reliant on the West. And of course, as I said previously, the US especially is quite involved. And so I think in this specific type of situation, what is meant by African solutions is that they do not want interference or prescriptions from the West, but obviously when this starts affecting Western interests as well, as we saw with attacks on certain embassies in East Africa, then of course, whether they want it or not, but Western countries will become involved anyway.
Martin, now in terms of, we look at the status quo on the continent, especially if we look at East Africa and West Africa and their fight against terrorism, clearly we're losing that war, aren't we?
So far one could say so, but I think there is a new awareness, a new consciousness coming up. Early this month, on the 2nd actually, to be precise, on the 2nd of September, African leaders met in Nairobi within the framework of the Peace and Security Council, which is the African Union's body that is responsible for dealing with peace and security on the continent. So this was the first time that the Peace and Security Council held its meeting at the level of head of state to discuss terrorism, which for some of us, it was the greatest thing to happen. It was historic in the sense that it gave, it illuminated the issue. It brought the issue to the fore of African politics and African agenda. But will this continue?
Martin, maybe here you can comment now on Westgate 1 year on. What lessons have we learned as a continent?
I think we've learned that we are extremely vulnerable and that the terrorists are ready to go at length and that they have no respect for human dignity. They would attack the most vulnerable in society, which means that the way they are fighting this war is not just going after the soldiers, the security forces. They will attack civilians, they will attack women and children. So we need to protect them. So there should be a new awareness of protection. We need to have African solutions now, not the political solutions that we've seen in the past.
Professor, your thoughts on lessons learned from Westgate?
I think what we have learned so far is that the basic countermeasures that we have put in place are not sufficient. Whether we can afford to put more countermeasures into place? I don't know. Is it possible to protect all civilians? I don't think so. But certainly, I think the point made about intelligence is true. One wants to try and prevent certain incidents from occurring. Of course, one cannot really deter all incidents, especially the more suicidal type of incidents. But those countries that are at risk should, I think, do more proper risk analysis of their own situation and also of those in neighboring countries which can pose a threat to them. And that's about the best one can do.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for speaking to us about terrorism on the continent. Well, that brings us to the end of yet another edition of Africa 360. Please tell us what you think of Africa and its ongoing fight against terrorism. Is this succeeding? You can join the debate by going to our Facebook page or tweet us your views at Africa360_ENCN. You can also send us an email to africa360@enca.com. Till next time, it's goodbye for now.